Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the young man who came up and gave us the beginning, the reading. I think it's important that young people, that we acknowledge young people when they're trying, when they do well, and when they, don't do so well. But in this case, this gentleman did very well, and I'd like to give a little bit of a hand of applause for Isaac. This week's reading gives us a spectacular closing to the book of Exodus. Parashiot Vayakhel, combined with Pekudei, takes us to the beginning of Adonai entering a meeting place with his people on earth for the very first time. We start the reading with the Lord explaining how the weekly Sabbath is to be treated as a holy day. In fact, it's actually one of the most amazing holy days because it creates a weekly environment where we can step into the cloud just as Moses did, both individually and as a community. In fact, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's not often mentioned this way. Genesis 2:2. If you have your books, your cell phones, open up to Genesis 2:2. We're going to read it both in English, and then we're going to look at it in a slightly different way. In Genesis 2:2, God completed on the seventh day his work that he made, and he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he made. Most versions will actually say he rested. But in Hebrew, it doesn't say rested. It says he Shabbat. It says Ve Shabbat, or and he Shabbat. Think about that for a moment. We think of rested, and we think that on the seventh day he rested, but actually it was something very unique, something supernatural. It was he Shabbat. He stopped the work of creation. He actually stopped on his own. The Shabbat is the first spiritual gift given to all mankind. It was before Abraham. It was before the children of Israel. And it was before Adam sinned. So what does that tell you? It was intended for all men everywhere. And it still is. To just stop. To quiet your mind and enter into a blessing. That's what the Sabbath is. And then I'm going to expand that a little further because it's actually right there in Genesis 2 for us to read. Unfortunately, we're hindered by the languages that are translating. The Shabbat is meant to be a time with the Creator, time with our Father. The natural world is buzzing, busy, constantly moving, doesn't stop, doesn't slow down for anything or anyone. And that's why Shabbat is a time outside of the natural world. Now you may notice it. If you're going about your business, you're coming to shul, whether you're walking or whether you're taking the transport, you'll notice that the rest of the world hasn't stopped. They're continuing to spin faster and faster. As a matter of fact, a gentleman rode up behind us coming in, wanted to get by, in a rush to get who knows where. That's what's happening in the world on Saturday when we take the time to stop. Shabbat is so much more than just rest and relaxation. In Hebrews 4, we see another reference to this special kind of rest. For somewhere he spoke about the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Hebrews 4:4. Here, that word is, and I haven't used my Greek in a long time, katapao. It's a Greek word. It means to make quiet, to restrain, to hold back from striving to do something. Greek uses a number of words for the word for rest, just like the word love has many different words in Greek. One of them is anapausis, which means cessation from labor and refreshment. And that's the one that we think of most when we hear the word rest. But katapalo is only used 4 times in the entire New Testament. And 3 of those refer to this special supernatural time called Shabbat. There is much more to Shabbat than just relaxing. And we celebrate the Shabbat every week as a foretaste of something much, much greater. In the same fashion, the tabernacle was given to the children of Israel as a representative of something much, much more amazing. But let's get back to this reading. It's really about 2 complete concepts leading up to the same event. It's just unusual that the Jewish calendar often brings these 2 together, because together they take a different meaning. The first portion speaks of a voluntary donation of materials to make the Mishkan. In fact, the people contribute so much that Moses has to tell them, stop, no more. And then the narrative grants a detailed description of all the items that they gave. The second portion speaks of the people presenting the work and building everything exactly as God commanded. I need to point out something special in verse 20. I know that many of you probably have not thought about this, but if you read it, turn to Exodus 40, verse 20 to 21. He placed the testimony into the ark. He set the poles on the ark and put the atonement cover on top of the ark. Now, we know that Moses didn't do this. That atonement cover was very heavy, and it was designed so that 2 Levites had to do it. He brought the ark into the tabernacle, set up the curtain as a screen, and screened off the ark of the testimony, just as Adonai had commanded Moses. Exodus 40, 20 through 21. Now, let's look at that again. Moses put the tablets of the testimony in the ark, in the sight of the people. The Mishkan was not built yet, not completely built. He put the tablets of testimony into this ark, this box, in the sight of everyone who was watching. He did it in the space outside of the building, in the open air. Then he had the ark carried into the tabernacle and into the Holy of Holies. Then he builds outward from there until the last thing he does is set up the courtyard and the fence around the tabernacle. Amazing. Amazing in one aspect in particular, because men have taken the Shabbat and have erected an even larger fence around it. Let that soak in for a minute. What Adonai did, what Moses did, was put the ark testimony together out in the open air. But men have taken the Shabbat and put it a larger fence, wrapped it around it. In doing so, what was supernatural, amazing, different, it became a long list of forbidden activities. It should be no surprise to anyone that the 49 forbidden labors on Shabbat come from this particular reading. Now, we heard the list. We heard it in Hebrew and we heard it in English. And I don't think that many of you know what the 39 labors are. So I'm going to pick out some of them. I'm going to take them by category. Field work. No reaping, no threshing, no threading, no baking. No kneading, no baking. Next is the making of the material curtains, done by the women. No cleaning, no combing, no making loops, no tying of knots, no sewing, and no tearing. How many of you men came here today and have tie-up shoes on? Okay, let's keep going forward. Making of leather curtains, again by the women. Making the beams of the Mishkan. You are not permitted on the Sabbath according to the laws of men. No writing, no erasing. Putting up and taking down the Mishkan. Well, we were in violation of that today because we put this beamer together from parts. But according to the laws of men, we're not supposed to do that. Adding the final touches to the Mishkan. No adjusting, no correcting. And then the things that we're most familiar with, extinguishing a fire and kindling a fire. Actually, for these reasons, we light the candles before the sun sets on Friday night and light the candles after sunset on Saturday night. No striking of the last hammer blow and no carrying. And I think almost everyone came in here with something in their hands. So now, when the first fruit of mankind was selected, back before these, hundreds of years before these 39 labors were put into place, the children of Israel, God codified the Sabbath. He made it a commandment. However, keep in mind that the Sabbath was established from the beginning of all mankind. As a matter of fact, righteous men and women kept the Sabbath long before Abraham. When the Sabbath was commanded, if you need to know who those people are, read the beginning of Genesis. When the Sabbath was commanded for the children of Israel, Adonai gave clear instructions. Not 39 labors you can't do. He said, don't kindle a fire on Shabbat. Exodus 35:3. Don't carry a burden or work on the Shabbat, including resting your animals. That's in Jeremiah 17:21. And that includes profit and non-profit work. That also includes chores around the house, home cleaning. Instead, we are to reflect on heavenly things. And for these reasons, the children of Israel and Judah were carried off into captivity because they had forgotten this basic principle. We are not to sell things on Shabbat. That's in Nehemiah 13. And we are to turn away from doing our own pleasure on Shabbat. Isaiah 58. Think about that for a moment. I think we're all guilty of doing that one. It's no surprise to anyone that Yeshua and his disciples were accused of breaking Shabbat on several occasions. I'll just give you two. In John 5:8, in John 5, verse 8 and 11 and 12, Yeshua healed a man and then told him to take up your bed and walk. Another example, in Luke 6, Yeshua and his disciples were walking through a grain field. And some of them were a little hungry, which happens Saturday mornings, right? So they're walking through a grain field and they pick up some of the little heads off the wheat and they rub it in their hands to get rid of the little fuzzy hairs and the husk. And guess what? Right behind them, always right behind Yeshua, were the Pharisees. You see, they weren't following just to put him down. That wasn't the case. They were actually following him because his thinking was very similar to what they had heard. So this time they were following him, and they immediately confronted him, claiming the disciples broke the Sabbath. They broke the Shabbat. In this case, Yeshua reminded them how David and his men ate consecrated showbread from the house of God. He asked these well-educated Pharisees, these teachers, or haven't you read in the Torah that on Shabbat, the Kohanim in the temple break Shabbat and yet are innocent? Think about that. What we do Saturday morning when we assemble this bima is we are serving as Kohanim. And Yeshua says, on Shabbat, the Kohanim in the temple break Shabbat and yet are innocent. But I'll tell you something greater than the temple is here. He was referring to himself. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of Shabbat. Matthew 12, 5 through 8. And Yeshua also said in this same incident in Mark, Shabbat was made for man, and not man for Shabbat. That's in Mark 2, verses 27. And to all of those out there who think Yeshua or Jesus made it okay to break the Shabbat, you are sadly mistaken. That's true. It's not Sunday. It's not Monday. It's not any other day of the week. It starts Friday night and continues until Saturday night. So let me state very clearly, if Yeshua had broken the Shabbat commandment, he would not have been raised up from the dead to the throne of grace. He would not have defeated death. Therefore, he did not break the Shabbat, and he didn't teach anybody to do it. Sin is a violation of Torah. You know that he appeared, Yeshua, appeared in order to take away sins. And there is no sin in him. 1 John 3, verses 4 through 5. You know, years ago, I studied at Lincoln Square. It's no mystery to anyone here. I met a young woman who wore 2 beepers around her waist. And I really liked her a lot. Perhaps much more than she realized, because sadly, I never said how I felt. She was much smaller than me, but strong as an ox. She practiced martial arts, and she could have easily flipped me on my backside, which she reminded me one time when she hugged me, if she wanted to, which was no small task. She spoke Hebrew fluently, but she didn't read biblical Hebrew, so she was studying with me, studying with us. She was raised in Israel. There were times when one of her beepers would go off silently, and whatever we were doing, whether it was in class or Shabbat service, she was out of there. It was finished, done. And me, well, the truth is, she worked in an emergency room. She was a doctor. And so later on, I inquired about medical workers because it seemed a mystery to me. In a class, I asked a rabbi, and the funny thing about it is, I learned that modern Jews would not have had a conflict with Yeshua healing on the Shabbat. Well, what caused that big change? About 300 years later, the rabbis developed a concept called pekush nefesh, or preservation of life. Wonder where they got that from? 300 years after Yeshua said it. You can see that in the Talmud in Yoma 85b. The rabbis are debating back and forth, and one statement struck me amazingly close. Yeshua said something similar to this. I won't read it to you. I want you to discover for yourself. But this is what the rabbis came to 300 years after Yeshua said it. Saving a life overrides Shabbat. Whoa. Amazing change of course here. So doctors, nurses, EMS, police, soldiers, all those who protect life, preserve life, and they can override Shabbat. But given the opportunity, they should assemble. But keep your uniforms on and keep your guns holstered. And if you were in Israel, you would see that. Soldiers attend with their rifles ready to go. Because at any moment, they have to be able to get out. The same thing with EMS workers. Life is precious to the one who creates life. You see, the mitzvah, all of them, issued by Adonai, does one thing in particular. They build up the man and the woman, the poor, the immigrant, and the orphan. And those who hinder them have to answer to someone. Remember I said Genesis 2? In Genesis 2:15, just a couple of verses later, Adonai introduces another concept that we also overlook and is connected to the Shabbat. Genesis 2 verses 15. Then Adonai Elohim took the man and gave him rest, is what the English says, in the Garden of Eden. And then here's the weird part. He gave him rest, but in order to cultivate and watch over it. Seems contradictory to our English minds, right? You put him in the garden to rest, but take care of the garden. He gave Adam a job that he could do even on the Sabbath. In Hebrew, that word rest in that verse means something very different from an intentional stopping or ceasing to labor. So we have the one on the one hand, and now we have another concept. Here, the word is yanak, and it means, listen to this, settle down, be quiet in your mind. Shabbat and yanak are interconnected. From the very beginning, Adonai Elohim ceased from working and intended to dwell permanently with all mankind. But he gave us a choice. And we chose to disobey through our parents and turn away from Adonai Elohim and turn away from the potential blessing of dwelling with our Father permanently. The servants who minister in the Mishkan, the temple, and at every bima does so to edify humanity and to bring them closer to the Creator, to enter that supernatural time called Shabbat, where the Father waits. Let that sink in for a moment. He speaks numerous times about allowing people to come to his rest. The showbread and the Mishkan, the altar, the menorah, Adonai has no need of any of those things. He doesn't need the bread. He doesn't need the light from our flimsy little lamps. He is the living bread. He is the source of light and life. Our breads rot. They just do. They don't last forever. Our lights can dim and they can blow out. But Adonai is eternal. He cannot be contained in a tent or a building made of stone or precious metals. The clouds and the earth melt before him. Even our lives would melt before him, before his presence. Look at the men and women who appear before him, even in just a vision. They fall face first into the ground, and an angel must lift them up. These are holy men, holy women, called by God to speak to them. They fall face forward, dead, and an angel must lift them up. Because even our life force fails before the power of Adonai. He told Moses, you can't see my face and live. It was never about the animals burning on the altar. I know we all love the temple. We all spend many chapters reading about it. But it was never about the animals burning on the altar. It was never about the sweet smell of incense. These things he gave to us to prepare our minds for the spirit which cannot be contained in time and space. That spirit, when we hear his voice, his natural voice, it sounds like the clap of thunder. If we are blessed enough to see him, his face looks like the sun. You can't keep looking at it. His presence, his power, can appear as a dove of energy or as a towering column of fire or a steady column of clouds that spin upwards toward the heavens. Everyone here has seen a hurricane or a tornado. They don't spin straight up. They twist off to the side. They lean. They do all kinds of amazing things. They don't stand straight up. The presence of God does. He gave us these things, the Shabbat, this tabernacle, and the temple, because he desires to have a relationship with us. But, contrary to what you have heard, he doesn't want us to come as we are. Why? Because our thoughts are selfish and petty. And he told the Israelites, he told Moses, let me go. Let me just break out among them. It would have wiped out the nation, and Moses had to beg him not to do it. Our thoughts are selfish and petty. We lust for things of the world. We can't help it. And the pleasures of our senses. I don't need to name them, because each one of us has a different thing that motivates us. What we are, is dust held together by a divine breath. And every day, every year, we wither and fade, whether we want to or not, no matter how many natural remedies you think you're going to come up with. No oils, no incense, nothing is going to keep you from fading and dying. It's the way it is. That's the way we are, because we are filled with sin constantly. The natural man is filled with selfish lust and sin, and he cannot enter into this Shabbat rest. So where does that leave us? We're practicing every single week to enter this place. Our Father, who formed us, desires that we stay with him. So what does that mean? It means the Shabbat is a way to prepare our natural bodies to let go of this world and the things of this world. And he knew that we couldn't do it on our own. He watched for generations. So he made a way through his word. His word. What is his word? It's both a book and a person. Now, his Son stands in the heavens, ready to separate those who are loved by the Father and precious to him. He maintains a book. He calls it a book. From those who refuse to grasp the eternal. I'm not talking about the people who never heard about Yeshua. I'm talking about the people who know him and walk away. They refuse to grasp the eternal. But it is not through sitting idle and waiting to fade. We must light a spiritual fire in ourselves. We grow that fire by serving and loving one another. That means being offended and getting over it. It means helping someone and not hearing thank you. It means serving and loving one another. One tree on fire is not a forest fire. In the same way, a forest wildfire cannot be contained because it touches every tree around it. It's a war. We need to start a spiritual fire in ourselves so that we can start the war. So we must set out to start a spiritual fire around us. How do you do it? Okay, here's the practical part. By prayer. It's called incense, a sweet aroma. And if you doubt that, look in Revelation. The prayers come before Adonai. By study. You ever wonder what that showbread was? If you think about it, you kind of remember that Yeshua said, I am the bread of life. That showbread is actually the eating of the bread of life, which is studying. And by service. the sacrifices, overcoming trials and helping others to do so, even if they don't say thank you. In doing so, we slowly begin to reflect the Father in all life from inside of us. Just as Moses' face shone when he went to the cloud. It just came from being in the presence of God. So the Mishkan and the temple were designed to point to the Son of Man. That was their whole purpose. Yeshua, who would come in the form of a man, who would willingly take upon himself my sins, and also your sins, and all of our sins, if we choose that path. He took a Mishkan, a tabernacle, of flesh and blood, and he turned it into a living spiritual temple designed by his Father and our Father. And in the process, he shows us the way home, enabling a collection of people to build an everlasting relationship with our Father. This is what the Mishkan was, and that is what the weekly Shabbat prepares us for, an everlasting relationship with our Father. Shabbat Shalom.
Beautiful.
Catch you by surprise.